Welcome to another episode of Bossing English with Mr. F. Today, a quick how-to of the unseen poetry question on paper 2 of the AQA GCSE English Literature exam. So this is the 24-mark question on which you will be examined on AO1, your personal critical response to the poem, including references and quotes to support your interpretations, and AO2, language, form and structural analysis about how meanings are created and the methods used and the effect on the reader, including use of subject terminology. No AO3, they are not expecting you to have any contextual knowledge of the poet or when it was written at all. So it's just what you see on the page and how you engage with that. And generally the poems they use are very accessible, and that's something to bear in mind. Okay, let's think about structure first of all. What do we mean by this? It's something that students find difficult. Well, we're going to look at a poem today and we're going to look at structure as our focus, but we'll look at a little bit of language and form as well. Okay, by structure, think of sequence. So, why does, if we're looking at a play like Macbeth, why does it open with the witches and why does it close with the crowning of a new king? So a poem is the same, but just on a much shorter form. Why does it start where it starts and why does it end where it ends, and what has changed maybe from the start to the end? Also think about any significant pauses. So this is the use of punctuation in the middle of a line, a caesura, or at the end of a line, end stopping. And you might also think about the flow of the poem, the enjambment, where there's no punctuation at the end of the line. And so lines run on and maybe between stanzas as well, which can be significant. And finally, does the poem's organisation, the use of stanzas, if there's a regular or irregular rhyme scheme, add anything to the meaning of the poem? Now, do remember to link all your ideas regarding structure back to the question keyword and the poem's meanings, plural, because there's bound to be multiple ways to interpret the poem. Okay, let's have a look at a poem and try and apply those ideas about structure. So the poem is Philip Larkin's Home is So Sad. Home is so sad, it stays as it was left, shaped to the comfort of the last to go, as if to win them back. Instead, bereft of anyone to please, it withers so, having no heart to put aside the theft and turn again to what it started as, a joyous shot at how things ought to be, long fallen wide. You can see how it was. Look at the pictures and the cutlery, the music in the piano stool, that vase. Okay, so let's start by looking at the structure of the poem. Okay, so immediately it opens with a very short resonant phrase, home is so sad, and we have that caesura bringing us to a halt and forcing us to think about that phrase. And of course, it's an antithetical phrase. Home isn't supposed to be sad. It's supposed to be happy and welcoming. So immediately the mood and tone of the poem is being set. Now, immediately I might look at the end of the poem and think, well, hang on a minute. There's another caesura in the final line. So it opens with a caesura, it closes with a caesura. So there's a kind of parallel between the opening and closing. And here we get that vase, and we might come back to that later. But already I can see a kind of structural mirroring or parallel between the start and the end. There is also a rhyme scheme. So it's an A-B-A-B-A rhyme scheme, 5 lines, regular stanzas. So we have left, go, bereft, so, theft in the first line, and we might choose to kind of look at what those words, why those words rhyme, and if there's any resonances or emphasis there. But maybe more significantly is what happens, because they are quite regular and full rhymes, but they become half rhymes and more maybe disharmonic or lacking in harmony, lacking in fullness and in the second stanza, as was vase. They are similar, but they're all half rhymes. They're not full rhymes. And maybe we could explore the way the rhyme scheme degrades, becomes less harmonic, moving from full to half, and link that back to the meaning of a poem where sadness and loss and a kind of funereal vibe is being put into play by the poet. So Moving on, there is an interesting use of enjambment as well, to put aside the theft and turn again to what it started as. And maybe we could explore why that is split across stanza A and the first stanza and the second stanza, and explore whether that use of enjambment adds anything. And finally, I think maybe I would personally be interested in this, a joyous shot at how things ought to be, because there's a lot to do with failure and how that domestic space fails to live up to what it should be. And that use of end stopping there, a joyous shot, so we get this hope and optimism in the start of the line. We pause with the end stopping of the comma at the end of the line, and then we move on to the following line, long fallen wide, and we're back in that somber, disconsolate mood that we started with, the idea of sadness, failure, and loss. Okay, so there are some structural ideas that we could gather and explore from that poem. Move on to language. Language means words, imagery, and devices. So a lexical field, words linked to a similar topic, like war or violence or something like that. Similes, metaphors, personification, all the usual gubbins there. Imagery, such as natural or violent, you might notice these images jumping out at you. And then word types. Are there any significant uses of nouns, verbs, adjectives, etc.? Well, maybe personal pronouns is another one, the use of I or you. Now, again, remember to link all your ideas back to the question keyword and the poem's meanings. Okay, let's start exploring. Well, for me, what jumps out at me is a lexical field of sadness, loss, and failure. So we've got sad, here, and then we move to the last to go, the idea of moving on, departing. Bereft is, a feeling of being empty and lacking. Withers, now we're linking more into like the idea of flowers and people aging, decaying. Having no heart, long fallen wide. We talked about that earlier, about the kind of sense of failure to live up to what was promised. So all of those words come under a lexical field of melancholia, loss, and failure. Other interesting things here is the use of direct address. Maybe he has a particular reader in mind. We're also getting some uses of imperative verbs, a command to look at the pictures. And then finally, we get this domestic imagery, cutlery, piano stool, vase. I mean, almost quite banal things. They don't really seem to be the subject of poetry. But in this poem about a domestic space, they become important and accrue meaning through the focus the poet gives them. Okay, so I think, it's interesting maybe that those images come right at the very end of the poem, where the camera zooms in on those three items. For me, the vase is really significant because I think that vase links back to withers and the idea of flowers. And for me, I might then, as an alternative interpretation, wonder, well, who gave those flowers? Were they his flowers and they've withered because someone's left, a wife, a partner, a girlfriend, a relative who's died? So the link between withers and vase, I think there's a lot you could pin those two ideas together and really explore why that vase becomes the closing image we take away from the poem. It's such a humdrum image, but when we start to think about the withering flowers that might be in there, who gave them, it starts to develop its resonance deeper and deeper. Okay, let's move on to form, another thing students find difficult. Form just means type of poem. So here are some types of poem: lyric poems, personal feelings expressed in the first person. Elegies are poems about death. Just going to have a look at how long I've got left. Okay, it's not flashing up. Free verse, when there's no rhyme scheme, and often the poems in question in this unseen poetry question are free verse, and we can explore why they're free verse. And sonnets, again, if you spot there are 14 lines and maybe a clear distinction between the octet, the 8-line opening, and the sestet, the closing, and then we might explore the volta, like how it changes from the problem of the opening to the solution in the sestet, and typically are about love, politics, and religion, and usually have specific rhyme scheme. And do remember to link all your ideas back to the question keyword and poem's meanings. Okay, so let's try and apply those ideas about form to the poem we've been looking at. All right, so there isn't an awful lot to say here. I think already we talked about in language that there was a funereal or melancholic or disconsolate, hopeless sense to the domestic space being a sad and melancholic place. So I might link this to elegy if I had to. Lyrics usually in the first person. We're not getting a first person here. We do get the second person in the direct address. So I would stick with it has an elegiac tone, and so it could be an elegy, but unusually it's not about a person, it's about a place. And we get that interesting, regularity of 5 lines with a regular rhyme scheme, and then 5 lines where the rhyme scheme just falls apart a little bit. And it sounds a bit almost like, again, I might tie this to the idea of music, of 2 chords, an opening chord, and then maybe a more, what's the word? Sort of like an opening chord, and then a second chord that's a bit more sharp or off key. There is a word, dissonant. There we are. So we go from consonants to dissonance, maybe. But yeah, elegiac, sad, bereft, withering. There's a sense of death haunting this poem. Okay, so if you covered all of those things, language, structure, form, and you kept tying it back to the meaning and the question keyword, you would perform well on this question. I hope that's been helpful to you. Smash that subscribe button, hit the like, whatever you're supposed to do, to Bossing English with Mr. F. More videos will appear soon. Bye for now.